Here is a turquoise ink by Sailor 641.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
The swatch lies. This is a great darker turquoise that looks very different than the swatch because the swatch lies. Generally, this is a fairly consistent tone and shading across all nibs, and thank goodness for that, because what I get is just so enjoyable. I will say that this is a turquoise that I do see myself wanting a bottle of. It just looks so damn good on the page. It really does.
The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice darker turquoise, really beautiful there, with no feathering and with no spread. There's a fair amount of shading that's going on. Now, it's a darker tone that we're getting here. So the shading, you have to look for those really dark areas, like quite. On the second line, the downstroke of the Q is a bit darker. It lightens up through the UI. The TE is very dark. Out goes from lighter to darker. Same with of, lighter to darker. Hearing, to change things up, goes from darker to lighter. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that's still going on. I just don't think it is as good as it was with the extra fine. Look at good on the second line, where the right side of the top loop of the G is a little bit darker than the whole rest of the G. It lightens up into the O's and the beginning of the D, but the up and down stroke of that D are very dark. Take that shading. Look at take right next to it. That goes from lighter to darker at the KE, much darker, and it's not faintly noticeable like it is on faintly directly above that, where mostly we get a nice darker tone. The I is slightly darker than the letters around it. It's during the T that it starts to darken up a little bit. Now the L is lighter on the top than it is on the bottom, and the Y is darker on the top than it is on the bottom. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, with no feathering, with no spread, with really good shading, galloping through everything that goes on. Look at gallop. First word, first line. The G is nice and dark. It lightens up into the OL. Second, LO. Darker. The P is only a tiny bit lighter. The E, a tiny bit lighter than that. And the D starts to darken up a bit. And then you get that up and down stroke. That's very dark, not slight at all. Looking at sight, I know I added an L for that one, which starts lighter, which is still a dark tone, until the hump of the H, where it does get darker, quite a bit darker, into that T. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. Now, there were times that the shading was going on here. It is not as good as it was on the Clairfontaine. Look at they were on the first line, where the T is lighter and the H gets a bit darker. The EY is lighter, but the downstroke and loop of that Y is nice and dark, where were starts lighter, gets very dark at the last E. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading. Look at the journey. First line, the T of the is a little bit lighter than he at the end. Now, journey is mostly a single tone in the darker turquoise, where shouldered directly underneath that, the S is lighter than the H, and the OU lighten up again. The L just a little bit darker, the D quite a bit darker, lightens up into the ERE, but then quite a bit darker at the D at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading from the start. Look at from the on the second line, where from is mostly a uniform tone in what's going on. The lighter T, much darker H, where that stark difference in shading really does happen quite a bit. Look at their share, first line. The TH is very dark, but the EIR lighten up a bit. The S is a tiny bit darker than it was with there. The H gets darker again into the A, R lightening up, and the E very dark again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, great ink.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine, and it's got more of that really turquoise look to it, where before, in its darker, it was really getting a whole something new about it that was so very nice to truly look at. Now we get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading. Look at To the Path on the second line, where 2 starts darker, gets lighter into the O, but the end of the O gets darker. As is the case, the T is lighter, he is darker. Path starts lighter, gets very dark at the H. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading. Not tons, it is strangled a little bit from this more absorbent paper. Look at strangled, mostly a uniform tone, only the D gets a little bit darker. Together on the second line, starts out as a lighter version of this ink, but during the T darkens up, very dark on the HE, slight lightening on the R. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is some shading to be seen. Look at blackened leaves on the first line, where blackened, the LA lighten up just a little bit. Gets very dark at the KE, NE lightens up a little bit, D does get a little bit darker. Leaves starts darker on the LE, lightens up on the AE, very dark on the ES. Looking at the back of the page, we see how great this ink is. No bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. Love it.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get the same level of shading that we had on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at gate on the first line, where the G is a little bit lighter than the 8, where directly underneath it, hole is quite dark. It's not a bright hole, it's a dark hole from behind, where the F is a little bit darker than the, sorry, it's not from, it's far behind. The F is a little bit darker than the R, and the B is a little lighter than the H, and then the IND does lighten up a little bit. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. While you might ask me about shading, we look at while on the first line, where the W is lighter than the H. It lightens up into the IL and then becomes very dark, coming out of the L into the E. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. The shading is here, not as strong as it was on the Clairfontaine, but either way you look at it, we're still getting some good shading. Look at either first line. The down part of the E is a bit darker than the rest of the E. Lighter into the it, but the her at the end, quite a bit darker. Same thing with side. It starts lighter on the SI and beginning of D, but it's the end of the D into the E that is quite dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Mint Turquoise. Here is Monteverde California Teal. Here is Noodler's Turquoise Eel. Here is Sailor Kobe number 44. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really being a very different kind of turquoise here. No feather, no spread, no shading, just there, looking really good, separating itself very well from the vertical lines behind it, making me very happy with how this would be for a student using this notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We still get no feathering, we still get no spread, we still get no shading, we still get a great tone on the page that is standing out against the vertical lines, making me very happy with the tones and everything I'm seeing here, despite there not being any shading. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get little bits of shading that we weren't having before. Look at could on the second line, where it's mostly a lighter tone, but the D does darken up. He to the left of that is darker than everything around it, and things to the left of that, the T is lighter than the H, which does darken up. The ing lightens up until the S at the end that does get darker. Looking at the back of the page, it's beautiful with no ghosting. Nothing bled through. Great ink for students, just wow.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Califolio Itsuyama. Here is a purple ink by Noodler's Purple Wampum. Here is a black ink by Noodler's Black. Here is a red ink by Montegrappa Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread, and this ink is just done so well on so many papers. I can't like what I'm seeing here. Not that it's bad. With the feathering, the spread, look at undergrowth on the third line. It's definitely there. A little bit distracting to me, only because of how good I know this was on every other paper. That aside, I'm going to say that what's happening here is very good for copy paper. You're even seeing small hints of shading. When the G of undergrowth touched the H of that, it got darker. The H of undergrowth got darker than the rest of the word. That on the fourth line, the T is lighter than the H or at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering and there is spread, and it is thick and kind of distracting. Look at thick on the first line. First word, really so much feathering going on. The wider nib really was not helping it here. I don't like this. I would not want to use this on this paper as a result of it. We do see some moments of shading that do happen in thick, like the H and the K are a bit darker. Forest underneath that, the T is darker. Floor starts a little darker on the F, lightens up on the lower at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread. I think the feathering and the spread are less distracting for the most part than it was with the medium. I have to say for the most part, because the on the first line, crazy amounts of feathering, as if they know they're about to come to the spider in the story. It's not feathering, it's now webbing. Now, shading, yes, there is some. If you look at dents on the second line, the downstroke of the D is a little bit darker. Same with the E. I'm not a fan of what I'm seeing here. I do think it's better than it was with the medium, though nowhere near as good as it was with the extra fine. Looking at the back of the page, I don't think you could write back here because of how deep the ink gets into the paper. That's the fault of the 20-pound toilet paper, not the ink. Now, with that, nothing bled through touching the page underneath, so there is a bright side, even with this great ink on toilet paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Everything looks exactly the same on fountain pen friendly paper, regardless of the nib, and we get an easy dealer's choice here. It just looks so good. Ink, enjoy, repeat with your favorite pens until you've destroyed a bottle of this ink, and then get a second bottle. But when it comes to non-fountain pen friendly papers, second verse, same as the first. Ink, enjoy, repeat. This still does so good. 20-pound copy paper wasn't my favorite, but stick with that extra fine nib there. Other than that, man, just enjoy the crap out of this. The dealer's choice.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.